On June 12, 2020, Mr. Rayshard Brooks was at the Wendy's on University Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia. And what had happened is, before 911 was even called that day, the employees were receiving complaints that there was a man passed out in behind the wheel of his vehicle in the drive-through lane. Now, if you remember back around that time when we were having COVID and all that, the drive-through was the only way you could get to the Wendy's. The dine-in was closed at that time. So the employees were receiving complaints that someone was blocking the drive-through. Eventually, the manager of Wendy's went out and knocked on the window of Mr. Rayshard Brooks, trying to wake him up. She knocked on the window, kept knocking on the window, was unable to wake him up. Finally, he woke up. He rolled down his window, and the manager asked him, "Would you please move your vehicle?" According to the statement made by the manager, the only thing Mr. Brooks did was stare at her, roll the window back up, and he fell back asleep. One Wendy's employee reports to the GBI, made a statement to the GBI that prior to calling 911, that Mr. Brooks had been at that Wendy's, parked in that drive-through lane for about 40 minutes. Finally, a call was made to 911, and Officer Brosnan was the first officer to respond. And you will see part of this videotape when Mr. Porter plays a video analysis. Now, let me point out the videotapes that we have and the whole timeline of how long Mr. Brooks was in an encounter with the Atlanta police officers is 40 minutes and 23 seconds. Obviously, we're not going to play that entire video, all the body cam videos and the Wendy's video for you today. But the entire time is 40 minutes and 23 seconds. During that 40 minutes and 23 seconds, there is conversation between Mr. Brooks and the police officers. Much of it, if not all of it, is cordial. It doesn't become cordial. It switches from cordial to violent when the officers seek to place him under arrest for driving under the influence, and Mr. Brooks lunges at both officers and basically overpowers the officers. And you'll see that. Manages to take the taser away from one officer, tries to tase that officer 2 times, tries to tase the other officer another time, manages to take off running, and he's pursued by Mr. Rolfe. He fires a taser back at Mr. Rolfe, and Officer Rolfe fires his weapon. And Mr. Porter will go into that in detail. But prior to that, Devin Brosnan shows up, knocks on the window, cannot awaken Mr. Brooks. He finally opens the door to the vehicle and again tries to wake Mr. Brooks, finally gets Mr. Brooks to wake up and says, "Hey, you're blocking the drive-through. You need to move your car. Please move your car." And Mr. Brooks looks at him, says, "Okay." And they shut the door. Brosnan begins walking back to his vehicle. Before Brosnan can get back to his vehicle, Mr. Brooks passes out again. Brosnan immediately turns back around, goes over, again knocks on the window, opens the door and says, "Hey, please move your vehicle. You got to move your vehicle." In one of those conversations, Brosnan even asked Brooks, he says, "Do you need medical attention? Do you need medical help?" Brooks says, "No, I'm fine." He says, "Well, you got to move your car." So he watches as Brooks moves his car out of the drive-through. And when Brooks moves his car out of the drive-through, what happens is Brooks drives over the curb onto the grass in a parking space. He then backs up into the parking space. Brosnan walks up to the car and asks Brooks for identification, goes back to his car, notices at that time the smell of alcohol. So he calls in for a DUI officer. That DUI officer, recognized as an expert in the DUI field, that DUI officer is Garrett Rolfe. About 10-15 minutes later, Garrett Rolfe arrives and asks a few questions of Officer Brosnan and says, "What's going on here?" Officer Brosnan explains to him the guy's been asleep behind the wheel of his car. I asked him to move his car. He drove over this curb. After he drove over this curb, I went to get his license. I noticed the smell of alcohol. Brosnan says, Garrett Rolfe says, "Okay." Then Garrett Rolfe goes over to start talking to Brooks. And as he's talking, he's asking him, "Where are you? Where have you been?" Brooks tells Brosnan that he's in Forest Park. Brooks tells Rolfe that he's in Clayton County and that he's at a hotel. He's staying at a hotel just down the road. Well, he's not in Clayton County. He's not in Forest Park. He's in Atlanta, Georgia. They notice glassy-eyed, a little bit of slurred speech. They do field sobriety tests. I say they. Officer Rolfe does field sobriety tests, and then asks Brooks if he'll take a breathalyzer test. And he says, yes, I'll take the breath test, the portable breath test. He takes the portable breath test, and again, let me point out now, we're over about 39 minutes into this whole situation. The conversation's been cordial. Mr. Brooks has been very cooperative. The officers have been professional. Everything's going as planned. He takes the portable field test. It comes back .108. And as y'all know, over .08 in Georgia's over the legal limit, and you're presumed to be under the influence at that point. It comes back .08. Officer Rolfe tells him, I think you've had too much to drink to be able to drive. And Officer Rolfe goes to place handcuffs on Mr. Brooks. And Officer Brosnan goes to get the other hand. When he does that, Brooks lunges forward and manages to get out of being handcuffed. He then is able to get Brosnan basically on his back. As he gets Brosnan on his back, he is getting control of Brosnan's taser. He grabs control of the taser. He finally gets control of the taser. And you'll also see in the video, and Mr. Porter will point this out, that at one time he strikes Officer Rolfe across the back of the neck, across the neck and the face. He gets the taser from Brosnan, and he tries to dry stun. He puts the taser against Brosnan's neck and tries to dry stun him. He then takes the taser, he aims it at Officer Rolfe and fires at Officer Rolfe. He also then, Brosnan now is on his knees. It's important to note that when all of them went down on their knees, Brosnan was on the bottom. Brosnan's head struck the concrete, the pavement of the Wendy's parking lot. He suffered a concussion, and he was a little bit out of it, but he managed to get to his knees. As Brosnan gets to his knees, Brooks holds the taser over him and fires almost point blank into his head. We know that the charge hits Brosnan in the hand, and Brosnan tells the police and the GBI that he felt the current going through his body. Again, Rolfe is trying to tase Brooks, but what happens, and again Mr. Porter will go through this with you, is the taser leads do not connect to make a good current. So one of them gets stuck in his clothing. Witnesses are reporting, are videotaping this too, and Mr. Porter will go into that. Brosnan's on the ground. Rolfe is over a little bit of a distance. Brooks takes off. Again, he's out of it. He's on the ground, and Rolfe takes off after him. As Rolfe is chasing him, you can see Brooks turn and fire the taser more than once. I think it was 3 times. He fires the taser at Officer Rolfe. During one of the times when Brooks is turning and firing, that is when Rolfe switches from his taser, starts to pull out his weapon, fires 3 shots within .56 seconds. Mr. Porter will go all over that. Those are the facts of the case in a synopsis. I will tell you this, part of, if you've left your email address with you, we're going to send you a full, what is called a case report and legal analysis. We will email that to you as soon as this press conference is over, along with the press release.